for some other folks to join us. We had a large group signing up for today's event, a global group. And I just want to give everybody a chance to sign in and see everything from the start. So just maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Thanks. Chain Insights webinar series. I am Constance Coral, Director of Marketing with Supply Chain Insights. Today we are presenting the Supply Chain Index, 20 years in the making, a focus on discrete industries. This is the second installment of presenting our exclusive supply chain and financial data, drawing conclusions on where we are after 30 years of supply chain management. This webinar is based on the Supply Chain Insights research report, Conquering the Supply Chain Effective Frontier, which includes analysis of financial balance sheet data from 1995 to 2012, and qualitative discussions with supply chain leaders in supply chain strategy engagements. Our speakers today are Lora Cecere, founder of Supply Chain Insights, a research firm that helps organizations achieve supply chain excellence. She is also author of the enterprise software blog, supplychainshaman.com, read by over 4,000 global supply chain executives. And this December is the launch of her first co-authored book, Bricks Matter. Abby Mayer is Research Associate at Supply Chain Insights. She is the author of the newly founded Supply Chain Index blog, which are reflections on supply chain performance and financial metrics. The ladies have a lot of great content to cover, so I'm going to go quickly over a few housekeeping items and then head right into today's presentation. We are going to save your questions for the end, but we'll compile them as we go. So when you have a question, go ahead and message it in the chat window to panelists. The Twitter hashtag for our event today is SCI Webinar, and you'll see on the bottom of our slide that hashtag as well as Lora and Abby's Twitter handles. Please feel free to tweet out to your network some fun facts and nuggets of information you may find interesting. We are going to also have a good 30 minutes after the webinar on Twitter where we'll address some questions that we didn't get to and have continue that conversation on Twitter. So now, without further ado, I would like to pass the baton over to Lora and Abby. Okay, I think we might have a technical difficulty here. Lora and Abby?
Okay, sorry. It looks like we were not off of mute. Thank you, Constance. Okay.
You're welcome.
So, Abby, are you there?
Yeah, I'm excited to be here today.
Okay. So, Abby and I have been working on analysis of supply chain financial metric data. And one of the things that we find is that the metrics and the ratios tell us so much about supply chains. And we've divided this into 2 sections. We discussed process industries, which are chemical, pharmaceutical, consumer packaged goods, food and beverage, in our last webinar. And today we're going to really focus on discrete industries, things that are made on product platforms like automobiles, things that are discrete like apparel and footwear, heavy equipment, and consumer high-tech electronics or hard disk drives. Now, these industries are very different, and one of the things I firmly believe is you can't put all industries in a spreadsheet and shake them up and say, who does supply chain best? I also believe that by looking at the metrics, you can really understand the concepts of trade-offs and balance. In the evolution of the writing for the book Bricks Matter, I kept hearing supply chain pioneers say time after time that you can't make an improvement in the supply chain in 1 or 2 years, but it takes at least 3 years. And so one of the things I wanted to do with the new company that I founded, and Abby was kind enough to be one of the first employees, was to build a database of financial data and build some financial ratios to be able to study it. So the book Bricks Matter will publish in December 2012, and is a study of some of the data that we're going to talk about today. The book at a foundational level looks at 30 years of supply chain management, and in 2012, supply chain is 30 years old. It's just a fantastic anniversary for supply chain. It was used for source, make, and deliver in a business context 30 years ago. Previously to that, it was more logistics or more procurement, or it was more about military logistics. So we've earned a place at the table to talk about supply chains, and supply chains matter. And the book is actually around market-driven differentiation, which looks at how do we map these processes outside in, and how do we really build value networks. So for background today, one of the things I found in the book, and I really firmly believe this, the more that I study these numbers, is that we don't have best practices. I think we have evolving practices. And by evolving practices, what I mean is we're still learning. So like the guy on the sidewalk, we're moving so fast against business objectives, and business elements are changing. But underneath our feet, ever so slowly, are the changing processes and technologies that are propelling us forward. I don't think we've arrived at the destination. I think we're on a journey. And as we look at the race for supply chain 2020, I think it's very important to understand the potential of the supply chain, where you have been, where you can go, and how you drive trade-offs and balance in looking at the financial balance sheet. I also think that it's important that supply chain teams learn to talk the language of supply chain finance. And one of the things that we often hear when we review this kind of data with people that ask us to run this kind of analysis is, well, how do you calculate that? And, is that supposed to be a big number or a little number? So getting in touch with what these ratios mean, I think, is a real opportunity for most supply chain teams. Now, we started the work because I firmly believe that in today's world, people want a benchmark. They want to know just how good is their supply chain doing. But most of the data that's in the industry is self-reported data. I interviewed 92 companies 5 years ago. I got their self-reported data, and I found out that most of the self-reported data is much like, me telling the weight for my driver's license, right? There's always bias, and, there's always overstatement or understatement, depending upon what people think that you want to know. There's also a lack of consistent definition. Forecast accuracy, on-time delivery. We lack a consistent definition in the industry to know what that is. And I believe that the particular data has got to have peer group relevancy. And that peer group needs to be held to the same standard. So by default, I decided that everyone that's public has a financial balance sheet, that supply chain is business, and what I wanted to do when I started the company Supply Chain Insights was I wanted to start harnessing financial data and look at ratios to be able to see what's happening. So it was about that time when I first started writing the book and I started the company Supply Chain Insights that I met Abby through a blog post. And initially, I asked Abby to come on board and go through some initial data collection. So Abby, tell the group how you did that.
Right. So back in February when I started, we were collecting balance sheet and income statement information. And that's usually available through annual reports and through the SEC website. And it was a very time-consuming and hard project to find where the data was available, then to pick the meaningful data and to compile that and build a spreadsheet template to be able to use that.
And so then one of the things that we did, Abby and I, we found that, currency was difficult from time to time, and we also found that the comparison of very large companies to a very small company was also problematic. So we decided that we needed to move the data from pure numbers to looking at ratios. So Abby, tell the group a little bit about that process.
Right, so that was a process of transforming that raw data that I had pulled from the annual report into meaningful ratios that could be compared across different industries and across different companies.
So Abby, today in the database, how many companies do you have for what period of time?
The period of time that we're using right now goes back to around 1995. Some companies I only have information back to 2000.
And one of the things that I wanted to do was to be sure that we didn't lose the memory of the supply chain. I was saddened to find that I couldn't get the data earlier than 1995. So then one of the things that we wanted to do was to determine industry best potential, because I firmly believe that you can't compare a chemical supply chain to high-tech and electronic supply chain. The drivers, the rhythms and cycles, and also the market factors are just too different. So one of the things that we decided to do in the launch of the company and the launch of the community, which is at www.scicommunity.com, was to offer a free service for companies to basically submit to Abby the financial ratios that they would like to run against their peer group. And the reason why we're doing this, it's our way of doing open research and having you help us with what are the peer groups and what do you see in the data. And we are publishing those on the community. So Abby, how would someone, if they like what we've done today, go about getting one of those analyses?
So there's 3 steps that we would go through together. The first would be the definition of the peer group. The second would be the choice of metrics. And for ease of choosing metrics, we've sorted the financial metrics into cycle, growth, complexity, and profitability categories. And then the third step is I'll work with you on the analysis to understand the story that's being told through these slides.
And our future is around building an index, which is going to be a formulaic indication of the trade-offs of the effective frontier for each of the industries. So we're on a journey here, and we've learned a lot as we've gone along. One of the things that we learned was that we aren't making much progress in inventory, with the exception of high-tech and electronics, that most industries are stalled with their work on days of inventory. And for many supply chain professionals, they're a little surprised by this. You know, I think that the wisdom of the crowd says, we've put in so many projects, you know, and each of the projects reduced costs and saved inventory. Well, I think one of the issues is we put in projects, but we didn't make systemic improvements, and the projects didn't always add up to be able to drive the real change in the balance sheet. So one of the issues we found was we still have opportunity in days of inventory. Now, many times people will say, but you know, the reason why we didn't make progress is supply chains have gotten so complex, and the cost of capital, and the supply chains are longer. And I say, I agree with that. That's all true. But one of the things I find the most interesting is the high-tech and electronics industry that had long supply chains, probably more business change than any other supply chain, had more impact from life cycles and business complexity, made the most progress. And so one of the things that I take away is that supply chain planning matters because I think the high-tech and electronics supply chain has some of the best planners, and that when margin matters and you have variable margin based upon the life cycle of the product, supply chain increases in importance and inventory increases in importance, and it gets done because it matters more. So one of the things that we've been studying is what is supply chain excellence. And you know, when we do open surveys, we publish all the surveys for you know, all supply chain professionals to be able to get at the data. And one of the recent studies that we did was around supply chain pain. And this is the pain of an individual. And we've been doing this in a couple of studies. And one of the issues for planners is that they can't get to data. The average company has 150 systems, so we're a long ways away from that one standardized system. But over and over again, I see the second factor playing a bigger role in the surveys that I'm doing right now, and that's the knowledge and understanding of the supply chain management or executive team and understanding supply chain excellence. I think we've not done enough around what is supply chain excellence and how does that tie to the business strategy. And today, one of the objectives that I would like to do is help you to be able to have a deeper discussion on this with your financial organization and to look more holistically about your results so that you can drive that discussion. So in the interviews with the supply chain pioneers, and we talked to 75 of them for the book, the first evolution of the supply chain was about efficiency. It was about the lowest cost and the shortest cycles for procure to pay and order to cash. But as the supply chain matured, the supply chain pioneers told me that they could not have an efficient, for example, the lowest cost supply chain, and also have customer service that would give them the right product at the right place, at the right time, at the right cost. And as a result, one of the things that happened was the trade-off of customer service with costs and cycles in early parts of sales and operations planning. And sales and operations planning is now 32 years old. But one of the things that I find fascinating in the balance sheet data that Abby and I are looking at is this concept of resiliency. And we've always talked about resiliency, but these numbers and these patterns are so much the demonstration of resiliency. It's about the absorption of demand volatility and supply volatility to be able to deliver reliable business results and avoid material events. And then one of the things we see as we move the supply chain across the sales and marketing and procurement functions to be able to have the end-to-end supply chain, we can have the conversation about becoming demand-driven to sense and shape. And most supply chains today are still very much about response. It's a pretty slow response, a pretty inflexible response. And the book is written around the concept of market-driven, which builds horizontal connectors of revenue management, sales and operations planning, supplier development, corporate social responsibility to connect the supply chain across the vertical silos to enable continuous learning and improving in the market, to use the new forms of predictive analytics from machine learning, machine-to-machine signals, and to be able to orchestrate demand and supply trade-offs through these advanced predictive analytics. But that's aspirational. That's where I think technologies are going. But for the team to get ready, I think one of the things we've got to think about is how do we manage the supply chain? And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the fact that a supply chain is a complex system with complex processes and increasing complexity. And a lot of the writing that I see is about complex processes or increasing complexity, but not about this thing called the complex system. Now, I'm an engineer, and I believe that, as good engineers, we sat in classes and we learned about complex systems. And it may be on a tough class, but, we all understand the complex system and process control and variance. And I think unless we manage the supply chain as a complex system to really be able to look at trade-offs and reducing variance and to be able to drive balance, we cannot get control of the supply chain and it whips us around. One of the things that I worry about, and we have an upcoming webinar on talent, is many of the new graduates for supply chain are coming out of business school without a strong engineering background around complex system management. And I worry about how we teach them about complex systems. The other thing that I've been thinking a lot about is that the data models to model complex systems that are inherent in our technologies are so important. And I think that unless you embrace the supply chain as a complex system, you will mistakenly believe that you can manage supply chain planning off of an Excel spreadsheet. The Excel spreadsheets do not have the ability to model the complex systems and the trade-offs. And so let me talk a little bit about what I mean by the supply chain as a complex system. The organization, by definition, is not set up to collaborate. The back office, where the supply chain often sits, is very, very focused on cost. The marketing officers are very focused on growth, and the sales teams are often focused on volume. And so it is a challenge of the supply chain leadership team to drive balance, to be able to truly align the supply chain end to end. And one of the things that I'm finding is that as we've defined the supply chain organization, we've defined it too narrowly, and that the organization will say they want to build the end-to-end supply chain. They really don't have the courage, and they don't know how to cross over sales and marketing and the procurement functions. So the center of the supply chain is stronger than the ends. But if we look at the supply chain as a complex system, and this is the reports that Constance was talking about earlier, at the top level, we want to drive profitable growth, and we want to trade off revenue and cost of goods sold, and we want to balance it with working capital. Most of the supply chains are out of balance with management against cash-to-cash or working capital objectives. We have new objectives around corporate social responsibility that have new impacts on the supply chain, and people that are very early into business continuity or looking at corporate social responsibility will often mistakenly think it's all about cost. It is not. It adds a different level of modeling and requirements into the supply chain. And then we have R&D strategies, and we have asset investment strategies. And after we do those choices, then I think we can talk about forecast accuracy, customer service, and inventory, and how that ties to our channel strategies, our product and portfolio strategies, and our supplier strategies. And then we can talk about sales policies, distribution policies, manufacturing policies, logistics policies, procurement policies, and then we get to waste. What I find most companies doing is they talk first about waste without really looking at the trade-offs that are made in the supply chain as a complex system. So as we think about the management of this complex system, you might want to say, well, who's best in class? And in the numbers we're going to show you today, we define best in class as a company that has 4 characteristics. Number 1, we've identified a peer group. We may not have the peer group right all the time, but we've identified what we think is a realistic peer group because, again, I don't think you can take all supply chains and put them in a spreadsheet and shake them up. It has to be against a peer group, and best in class is performance better than the peer group. Also, the company shows year-over-year improvements. And number 3, there's consistency in results. And one of the issues I see in the discrete supply chains is there is less consistency in results than I see in the process supply chains. 4, there's leadership in managing the trade-off. So there's deliberate choice in terms of what companies want to be good at, and these companies are expanding the limits of the effective frontier. Now, the metrics that we wanted to get off of the balance sheet, because again, the industry had a lot of self-reported metrics, so we sat down and we really said, you know, how could we think about these metrics against the framework we built on the effective frontier? So we divided the metrics, as Abby was saying, into profitability, growth, cycle, and complexity. And at first, Abby and I started running all of these metrics really at the intersections of the columns. And Abby, which metrics do you find give us the best indication of supply chain health?
I think some of the most meaningful metrics that we're using right now are cash-to-cash cycle and gross margin. I think that's an interesting comparison to make. And we've also done inventory turns versus revenue per employee. You'll see those 2 today. And then the last one that we've just recently started running looks at days of payables versus days of sales outstanding.
And one of the things that we're writing about right now is, you know, have we reduced, you know, our conditions on what we're asking for in procurement and made those payables so stringent that we're causing the supply chain to be less resilient. And so that's one of the things that we're currently studying. So we're looking at the intersection, and again, if you would like to understand your supply chain versus peer group, we would be glad to run that and give you analysis similar to what you're going to see today. Now, this is an example of a cross-industry analysis, and this is, I think, very, very demonstrative of a couple of points that I talked about and what drives supply chain leadership. Just to give you an orientation of how you read this slide, because you may think, whoa, this looks like a modern art slide, right? Now, what we have here are some industry leaders. You know, if you ask companies, if Colgate-Palmolive, Merck, Procter & Gamble, DuPont, Samsung, Zimmer Holdings were supply chain leaders, they may not know who Zimmer is, which does medical devices, but they'll know the rest, and they'll shake their heads and they'll say, yes, these are supply chain leaders. And if you ask, how do you feel about cash to cash? Is it important? And how do you feel about gross margin? They would say, yeah, that's important. And people might ask you to define how you measure cash to cash, and you'd have to go back through the formula. And essentially what we want to have are short cash to cash cycles, and we want to have the best gross margin possible. So when you look at each of these supply chain leaders, which they're very much similar to their peer group, and the patterns that you see in this, you can see that you have much better gross margin in medical devices and pharmaceuticals than you do in chemical companies. But likewise, what you can see is that the patterns of some companies are very, very tight, and the patterns of other companies against this index are not so tight. So if you look at the comparison of Colgate versus Procter & Gamble, you can see that Colgate has a very, very tight set of points, showing that there was not much distortion over the period of time, whereas Merck has a lot of distortion over the period of time of 2001 to 2011. And in the downturn of the recession, which was also a time they were going through acquisition, they saw a big swing in cash to cash that was a negative swing. DuPont and Samsung, which are on the left-hand side, are actually going back and forth on gross margin with fairly constant cash to cash. Now, Abby has helped us here. In the boxes, you will find the averages. And the first average is, or the first point is gross margin, and the second is the cash to cash cycle. Now, you might argue with us, well, who has the best supply chain off of this chart? I don't think that's the discussion we should be having. I think the discussion that I want supply chain leaders to have is to look at the potential of the supply chains and the potential patterns and think about three things. One, to think about resiliency, the ability for the supply chain to absorb demand and supply shocks. Number two, to think about improvements. So you can see Procter & Gamble may have not made dramatic improvements, but they have made good progress in recent years on cash to cash, and it's consistent. And three, to think about supply chain potential. Abby, did I miss anything on this chart? Anything you want to add?
No, I think that's good. And what we want to see is those companies moving to that bottom right-hand corner. And I think you see that most visibly with Procter & Gamble and Colgate.
Yeah, and one of the things we see in the discrete industries that is demonstrated by this chart is there are bigger swings in the patterns. And what we're trying to do is to understand how companies can reduce those swings and improve resilience. Now, let's also look at value chain leaders. So the other thing we're doing is we're looking at value chains, which are the combination of companies which add up the value chain. So if we look here at Intel, which is the furthest right with the best gross margin, but you can see some swings in cash to cash, but some improvement in gross margin over the period of time. And we look at Samsung, which is the green, and not as big a swings as Intel. And we look at Best Buy. Best Buy has actually not made progress on cash to cash. They've made slight improvement on gross margin. You can see some very different patterns. One of the things that we're studying is really this concept of collaboration. There is a belief in the industry that supply chains have collaborated, and reduced cash to cash and reduced gross margin or cost. And one of the things that we're having difficulty finding as we study these charts are how have companies truly collaborated to reduce costs and improve cash to cash. At this point in time, we do not believe that there have been many cases of true collaboration around the delivery of win-win value propositions. What we feel is that in most cases, there has been a transference of cost and inventory burden from player to player as we move backward in the supply chain, which has weakened the supply chain. So one of the things that we're studying, and we don't have all the answers yet, are value chain symbols or patterns like these to look at what's happening. So with that, let's look at some of the discrete leaders. We are, again, looking at the intersection of these ratios. So the profitability ratio that we're looking at is gross margin. We're looking at 2 cycle ratios, cash to cash, which we want very short cash to cash, inventory turns, which we want fast inventory turns, and we're looking at revenue per employee. We actually see that the greatest impact of enterprise resource planning, often called ERP, is on revenue per employee, and often it's also seen in SG&A. So the metrics, you want to go through the definitions here, Abby?
Yep, so gross margin is defined as revenue minus cost of goods sold, and then we're dividing that again by revenue. The cash-to-cash cycle is days of inventory plus days of receivables, and then we're subtracting days of payables. Inventory turns is cost of goods sold divided by inventory, and then revenue per employee, pretty self-explanatory. It is revenue divided by employee count.
So do you have any problems finding these on the financial balance sheets to get the ratios, Abby?
Most of these numbers are usually generally available, and we just put up the equations to make sure that everyone is on the same page and understanding the inputs that we're using.
Right. So let's look at automotive. You know, here we have Ford, Honda, Toyota, and Volkswagen. And many times people will say, who does this best? And they might say Toyota, or some might say Volkswagen, some might say Honda. You can see that the companies tend to be fairly large, and they also tend to be global. So when we look at the evolution of their metrics, what we see is Ford, which is in the worst gross margin position, and has a flat line around cash to cash, but has not made a lot of progress, but a lot of variation. Now when we look at Honda, we see the best gross margin, and we see that even though they have not made recent progress on cash to cash, fairly decent cash to cash objectives, and the tightest locus is around Volkswagen. And if we look at Toyota, you know, we talk a lot about lean. I love what Toyota has done about lean, but we actually see a reversal of gross margin here with Toyota. And Toyota was hit fairly hard in the last year with some of the issues that happened in both Japan and Thailand. Abby, what are your thoughts here?
I think what jumps out at me from this slide is we're looking for that tight pattern to show resilience, and so we don't like those large swings that Ford is demonstrating. And I think Volkswagen appears to be really stable, and they have those small movements.
Right. I think Volkswagen's more resilient. I think Honda has a better cost position. Now, when we look at a different intersection, and I would encourage people to do this when you ask Abby to run your ratios for you, is don't just look at one intersection. So, you know, you can also look at revenue per employee, and you'll see a different view. Now, let's look at high-tech and electronics. So Apple, LG, Motorola, and Samsung, very different companies, you know, different sizes, different platforms. And when we look here at the patterns, let's just take a minute to look at it because I know the slides may seem overwhelming. On the left-hand side, which is a light green, we have LG Electronics. LG has the tightest pattern and also has the less desirable position on gross margin. And when we look at red, which is Samsung, you can see that Samsung has actually had more oscillation in that period. And on the averages, which are the diamonds, and Abby has helped us out here to give us the averages, you can see that they have a better gross margin, less resiliency than LG, and they have gone back and forth on gross margin, but have not had as big a swings on cash to cash as what you see with Motorola, which pushed down cash to cash and could not sustain it through the recession. And also they had a number of product platform issues. But if we look at Apple with a negative cash to cash position and the design of the supply chain and the continued improvement on gross margin, we see that while there is some variation, that shows continued improvement, and it's really around innovation and it's the design of the supply chain for that negative cash-to-cash position. Abby, any thoughts here?
Yeah, when I look at this chart, I noticed that Motorola and Apple both have the same general pattern. So they started in the upper left-hand corner, and now they're moving to the best scenario in the bottom right. And that difference is just that Apple started out a lot lower on the cash-to-cash value.
And I think it's the design of the supply chain that allowed them to do that. But, you know, what we want is continued improvement, and we also want resiliency. Now, if we look at another intersection, so again, I was saying that, you know, it's useful to have Abby run at different intersection points on those 4 columns of metrics. And again, we will be glad to do this for anyone on the phone for free. What you can see is that far and away, the Apple improvement on revenue per employee is staggering, right? If you look at, you know, the movement on revenue per employee and also the ability to move the inventory turns back to almost the 2002 levels through all of the product launches. If you look at their peer group, and some may argue it may not even be a peer group because of the type of electronics, which is always a good dialogue, you can see that LG has a much more efficient organization in terms of revenue, not as profitable if you remember the profitability, than Samsung. Samsung is more profitable, but that they do not have the same revenue per employee. And you can see then the overlay of Motorola. Very interesting. It's a different slice, but it really brings the discussion about what is supply chain excellence. Is supply chain excellence around cash to cash and profitability? Is it on revenue per employee? And there are 3 mistakes I see people make. One is they don't look holistically enough at year-over-year results. Number 2, they don't look holistically enough against different points of the metrics to see. And number 3, they don't tie it to strategy. Abby, anything on this chart you want to add?
I commented on this on my blog recently, and it was just, I think there's always a lot of conversation about Apple's supply chain. It's always at the top of the rankings. And this was really a neat exercise to go behind the numbers and really understand what's going on there that sets them apart.
However, many would argue that they don't have the potential of Apple, and, you know, I think that's a fair argument. And so, you know, you've really got to look at the companies that are the best peer group for your potential of your supply chain. But, you know, one of the things I'm hoping that the people that are on the audience are seeing is how different the patterns are. And it's really this pattern recognition that we're studying and we're very excited about. All right, let's take medical devices. Now, if we think about the 3 supply chains in my work with these companies, I would rate high-tech and electronics to be much more advanced than automotive, and medical device companies to be less advanced than automotive in planning. So there's a continuum. I would rank high-tech and electronics as higher, automotive in the middle, and medical devices as companies that are evolving. These tend to be very profitable items, but they tend to be more of a lumpier demand and heavily regulated by the government. So what we're looking at here are 3 companies, Boston Scientific, Medtronic, and St. Jude, and we're looking at what are the patterns here for medical device. Now, if we look at this, I think, again, we can see very random patterns. We're early into this analysis. I am unclear if this is related to supply chain excellence or just some lumpiness of the demand patterns and the supply variability that we see, or the changing platforms due to compliance. I just want to bring this out so that you can see the random nature of the patterns that these supply chain leaders are trying to manage. Now, if we look to the right-hand side, we can see Medtronic with much better gross margin, and they are moving in the direction of a better cash-to-cash with a much tighter loci. But if we look at the evolution of St. Jude Medical, that starts with a very high cash-to-cash, wanders, and is moving on a gross margin plane, their team is probably working on reducing cost without really keeping an eye on cash-to-cash, but that's what we're studying. Now, if we look at the evolution of Boston Scientific that goes in a more loop, this is more of a characteristic of a supply chain that is being whipped around and more reactive. But again, we're doing interviews to understand all the business drivers. However, the patterns usually are a very good indication of potential, of what's happened in the strategy, and our ability to interview companies. What tells us very quickly supply chain maturity is when we interview the supply chain leaders in these companies and they can tell us underneath the numbers. What indicates a lack of maturity is when we show them the numbers and they go, I got to think about that and get back to you. Abby, what do you see here?
Right. I think the pattern recognition is an important topic to note. And also, I see, Boston Scientific, as you mentioned, is just moving in that circle. And in the middle of the decade, something happened, and they lost all of that progress that they had made on gross margin.
Right. And I, based upon what I know, I think it was compliance, but we're still looking at that. So, so just to start to wrap up, a lot of people will say, I do supply chain best, or, so-and-so does supply chain best. Maybe it's Procter & Gamble, maybe it's Apple, maybe it's DuPont. I don't think it's that simple. I think that what we have to do is say supply chain excellence delivers the business strategy against conscious choice and balance and resiliency. And I think we've not done enough hard work to look at supply chain ratios and to be conscious about the trade-offs, to understand the potential of the supply chain, and to really drive that choice and to be able to pull up a seat at the table with the financial group and drive a discussion around the effective frontier of the intersection of these financial metrics to say, what do we want to be? Now, if you think about what you're doing, I'd like you to think about supply chain management's 30 years old. But this definition of supply chain is evolving. And I think that the delivery and the determination of the potential of the supply chain can best be measured through the analysis of financial metrics and the balance sheet. And we want to make this a reality for you. So we would invite everyone to join us. The supply chain community is free to everyone, all supply chain leaders. It's our commitment to the supply chain professional. If you would like to have a peer group analysis done for you, we would love to do that. The only thing we would like to do is to be able to understand your patterns and interview you so that we can better understand supply chain resiliency and the evolution of supply chain. And Abby would be glad to run those for you. She's in the community. She's called Index Girl, and we would love to have you join it. We started the community in September, and we currently have 400 people that are part of it. Constance, questions for us?
Lora and Abby, thank you so much. We actually do have a couple of questions from the audience here. The first one is, does resiliency mean a consistent set of data?
So I think resiliency is the ability to have the same cost, quality, and customer service given demand and supply variability. And many people think that you can get there by just reducing cycles, and I think you've got to design the supply chain to absorb demand and supply variability, and you've got to also design it for business changes. So does it require a common set of data? You know, a lot of times people will tell me that they've got master data issues, they got dirty data, and what I find is they've got different data because the average company has 150 applications. It's quite messy out there. But I think, you know, one of the things that people have got to do is they've got to get past the fact that the data is different, and they've got to put in analytics to use different data forms and to normalize the data. But they've got to get really clear on holistic measurement and thinking about the supply chain as a complex system. I think the ability to mine financial data, to look at your divisions and your supply chains using the effective frontier is an opportunity and could be a challenge for companies if they don't have data. You know, the ability to get at data, unfortunately, Constance, is an issue for most companies because they implemented supply chain systems as projects, and they implemented them assuming that they're best processes, and as a result, they don't fit together and they can't get to data. I hope that answers the question for the respondent.
Sure, and that seems to be a consistent talent issue then, correct?
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay. And you know, Laura and Abby, I was actually wondering, did you have any expectations before you saw the results?
Abby, how about yourself? What did you think?
I don't think so. You know, every set of charts that I build, I learn something from. And so I try to go in and try to learn from the data without putting my expectations onto that data set. And so it's interesting to see those patterns, and I think my understanding of resiliency has really improved by doing this work and understanding that we want to see those small, consistent improvements, and that's what we look for in those best-in-class supply chains.
You know, I was surprised. I thought that there would be less of a difference between discrete and process supply chains. When we first did the analysis of Procter & Gamble and Colgate, Abby and I said, well, that's not a lot of change. And then what we found was that's not so bad. When we started to see all of the swings and the wild swings, you know, of what we saw from other industries, I went back and I said, I need to have a new respect for this. And when I look at the companies that I've heard, you know, speak about supply chain excellence for all these years, and I look at the fact that they really have not reduced inventory, they really have not changed their cost position, they've got these wild swings, I'm like, this is an excellence, right? We really need to be talking more holistically about, you know, these four kinds of metrics and how we drive year-over-year improvement. And so it's really elevated my thinking, and it's my hope it elevates the thinking of the people on the webinar as well.
Great. One more question. Why have you chosen to compare cash to cash and gross margin? Why not other comparisons?
Abby, you want to take that?
Yeah, I think we settled on that comparison because I think it helps present a really holistic picture of the supply chain, and it's also two metrics that most supply chain professionals are really focused on, and they understand them, and so it's an easy way to begin that conversation.
So I would say it's where we saw the best definition of pattern, number one, and number two, those are two metrics that no one disagrees matter. You know, they may not know Altman Z, and they may question days payable, DPO versus DSO, but cash to cash and gross margin, you know, they may argue and they may want to see return on assets, you know, on the x-axis versus gross margin. But generally, people say, yep, those are good metrics, and we see really instructive patterns through running that particular metric set.
Okay. You know what, I have sort of a part two to that resiliency question. Just a clarification, what he meant was consistent metrics as published in the webinar. So does resiliency mean a consistent metric, I guess?
we're actually trying to define resiliency using this particular methodology. We're not all the way there yet. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking these charts and interviewing the companies that, have actually forged the supply chain pioneers and the effective frontiers and understand how they defined resiliency and what happened in their supply chain. We're testing the area underneath the swings to see if, perhaps those that have, changed payables to be really long have affected resiliency of the supply chain. We're not real sure, Constance. I think this kind of work has never been done before, but to me, resiliency is the ability for the supply chain to absorb the demand and supply shocks and to be able to deliver consistency of balance sheet returns.
Okay, okay. So who's doing it best? Who's doing supply chain best?
Well, I think that, it's the company that's able to do better than peer group with year-over-year results and to be able to have resiliency. And so far, I'm very impressed with Procter & Gamble and Colgate. I don't see a lot of swings. I see consistent improvement. Procter & Gamble does better on revenue per employee. Procter & Gamble does, Colgate does better on gross margin. Procter & Gamble does better on revenue per employee. But, some of the wild swings of Discrete bother me, and I wanted to better understand why Discrete industries are not able to better have consistency of results. The high-tech and electronics industry, I think, does the best job of planning. We can see that in inventory. We can see that in what has happened in supplier management and procurement and the management of outsourced manufacturing. The worst industries, I think, are in pharmaceutical, medical devices, the companies that are slower to adopt supply chain practices, and there's almost an inverse relationship between excellent margins and supply chain excellence.
Okay. Okay. Well, any more questions from the audience? Okay, well, we'll be continuing this conversation on Twitter. Laura, did you have something to add?
Well, I just want to thank Abby for all her hard work, and I would encourage people to come and ask Abby to run your particular peer group and see what your supply chain effective frontier looks like. Thank you very much.
Great, great. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation on Twitter. Follow along and participate with #SCI webinar. Today's content is available on SlideShare, and our website, supplychaininsights.com. Look for Conquering the Supply Chain Effective Frontier as that research report. Friend me, as well as Laura, Abby, and the whole SCI team in our Supply Chain Insights Community.com network. Let's continue this conversation over there as well. And we have a commitment to monthly webinars. So as we mentioned several times throughout the webinar, we have a very, very special webcast on November 8th in conjunction with the well-known publication Supply Chain Brain. It's Supply Chain Talent, the Missing Link, and we have so far folks from Procter & Gamble as well as well-known author Marcia Connor as our panelists. I think you really will enjoy this. It's a really, really hot topic right now, and certainly a challenge for so many companies. They have that vacant position open for 6 to 9 months, and we're trying to, really nail down and see what's the heart of the matter there. So to register, go to supplychaininsights.com/upcoming-webinars and sign up for that one for November 8th. Thank you again for participating. Have a great day.